Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Dr. Vance Vredenburg. During our conversation, Vance talks about the history of extinctions on Earth, his influential paper, Are We in the Midst of a Sixth Mass Extinction?, and what humans can do to decrease extinction rates throughout the world. All right. Well, Vance, first of all, wanted to thank you for taking the time to sit down and talk, and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Pleasure to be here.
Cool. Well, we'd love to start by learning a little bit about you personally. I know you have an interest in amphibians and in science. Where does that come from? Have you always sort of been scientifically inclined? How did you get interested in the subject generally?
I think I've always been really interested, actually, from my early years. I've always been really interested in how things work, and in particular how things work outside. And I've always just been a curious person. I think people that are really curious tend to be sort of naturally good at science, because what we're trying to do is explain the unexplained. Yeah.
Was your interest in science always sort of directed to like the biological sciences, or was it sort of more wide-ranging to additional subjects?
It's always sort of been more biological. Yeah. Actually, for a while, I thought I wanted to be a medical doctor.
Okay.
Until I realized I'm deathly afraid of needles. I decided that's a bad idea.
Nice. Nice. So, here we are at San Francisco State. What was sort of the journey for you getting here? Did you sort of grow up in the Bay Area and want to be in San Francisco? How did you end up here at the school?
So I actually grew up in Mexico as a kid. My mom's family is from Mexico. So I spent my summers, my family would drive from Mexico City all the way up to Canada. And so that's when I really got the experience going camping with them and that sort of thing, car camping, that sort of thing. So I grew up in Mexico and then went to high school in Texas, junior high and high school in Texas. And then when I went to undergraduate, I went to out here to California, UC Santa Barbara. And then once I was in California, it sort of fit with the way I like to live a lot, I guess. Yeah. So I really like the public school system here in California, higher education. Yeah. And it's just worked really well for me. So I went from undergraduate at UC Santa Barbara, and then I worked for a few years doing research. Yep. And then I sort of realized, wow, maybe I could do my own work instead of working for other people. And I had some fantastic opportunities as an undergraduate, working in the Antarctic and working off the Channel Islands in California, in the Caribbean, and then in the Sierra Nevada here in California. And that's where I sort of found this project.
Cool. What does research, for someone who is not that familiar with the sort of field work that you may have done, what does a day in the field look like, and what was it about that was particularly appealing for you personally?
So the day in the field, really varies depending on where you are, of course, from Antarctica to Alaska to, when I was working as a scuba diver researcher, a day in the field meant getting up at the crack of dawn and getting out in these little skiffs and putting on a scuba tank and literally jumping in the water before the sun was up. And watching the reef animals sort of wake up in the morning so we could get a whole day's worth of data. The working terrestrially, obviously, is a very different story. Working on now the kind of work that I do now, which is working on amphibians. But it gives you a connection to nature in a way that most other types of jobs aren't. Don't give you that opportunity. So one of the places I've spent a lot of time sort of learning how to be a scientist was when I was a graduate student at Berkeley. I worked in the Sierra Nevada, and I did all this work basically with a backpack and a few frog nets, and I lived in a tent. And it was really an amazing experience. At one point, I didn't see another human for 4.5 weeks, and it was really an amazing experience.
And you, I guess, when you're on assignment like that and you're doing scientific research, there's just you in a tent and you're going out there and collecting samples from nature, I assume, and doing that on your own and being trusted to do that work. Is that a fair assessment of what that month was like? And has it become more difficult to get the funding to do research like that, or not necessarily?
Yes, so definitely it's gotten more difficult. Just as an example, in the National Science Foundation, the panels that I apply for funding, the funding rate right now is somewhere around 6%. And maybe 15 years ago, it might have been closer to 20%. So the funding rates have really gone down, mostly in the sense that there hasn't been more money made available, and yet we're training all these PhDs and everyone. So there's a lot more people applying for a pot of money that hasn't been growing. That's part of the problem, but there's other issues as well. In terms of like what it's like in the field and collecting data, it varies so much from place to place. For a couple of years, I worked on a research boat in the Antarctic where there were 40 scientists on board, and decisions were made at a much higher level than I was just working as a lowly technician. But I learned a lot, and I realized that in many cases, scientists have to work in really tight cohesion to collect information. For example, when they're on an icebreaker that costs $20,000 a day to run. Or you can have the other extreme, which is what I went to after that, which was working out of my backpack, where I was the only person out there, and I had goals that I had. I had numerous populations that I wanted to sample, both collecting scientific tissue, like DNA, but I also wanted to just count populations. So it was kind of up to me. If I wanted to take a day off, that's fine, but I usually didn't because I enjoyed the work, and the more data I could get, the better picture I could paint of what was happening up there.
Is the stress level of a day of actually collecting samples significantly higher than just going for a walk in the woods? I mean, is the distinction between work and play noticeable in your head, or do you sort of view that as sort of one and the same?
That's a really good question. People joke with me about that. Like, oh, it must be really fun. I have like a field season. I have field sites all over the world. I have one in the Philippines, one in South America and Peru. And people are like, oh, wow, that must be great. You get your summers off and you go. And what they don't realize is it's incredibly stressful. You have a really limited amount of time to collect the data you want to collect. And if it rains or if there's a lightning strike or something and you can't, it's not safe to be out there, you can't get any data. And you have you're dead in the water, basically. So it can be incredibly stressful. So I would say, like, it's incredibly enjoyable because I enjoy being outdoors and I enjoy understanding, gaining an understanding of what's going on in the natural world. There's nothing like going through a walk of the woods and actually knowing what the woods are. You see things that people for the first time don't see.
Right.
On the other hand, there are things you have to get done because if you don't, then you're not going to be around very long. I mean, you're not going to be doing that kind of thing for very long, if that makes sense.
Yeah. What does a walk in the woods look like to you? I mean, when you go and you're on a scientific research trip and you're alone or even with other scientists, is there, if you had a layman with you, what sort of world are you viewing when you see the woods like that? Do you see just the general biodiversity? Do you pick out certain things that just most people would never notice? How does it look when you walk through the woods?
Well, that's a great question, and it totally varies on what the reason for the walk is. So I teach a natural history class here at SF State, and when we walk through the woods, then I'm looking really broadly across. For example, looking from birds to snakes to salamanders and frogs, and we're trying to sort of find as much as we can so that people can see, so the students can see what it's like and see what they are and learn how to identify those things. But in terms of like strictly research walk through the woods, it's very different. So, for example, I have a project right now that's looking at salamanders here in California, and to find a salamander in California, you usually have to look under what we call cover objects. So if you go on a hike in the woods with someone like me doing research, you won't get very far because every 5 feet we're stopping to roll a log over or a big rock or, just basically looking in every microhabitat we can to see if we can find any of these animals. And if we do find them, then it's really exciting because now we get to collect data on them. So we'll do things like we'll give each animal a number, and we'll put that information in our notebooks, and I work on a communicable disease in amphibians. It's a fungal disease. And so we collect data by taking what looks like a Q-tip and rubbing it on the skin of the frog or the salamander. And then we take a bunch of measurements on the salamander or frog. How big are they? How much do they weigh? What sex? What species? Who are they close to? What kind of cover object are they under? Everything we can, even air temperatures and the moisture content of the air. It's crazy, all this stuff. And then we let the animal go. But we may catch 10 or 15 animals in one little spot. So we may not be leaving that spot for half an hour while we take all the information down.
Right.
So it can be really... it can be really fun, but it's super intense.
Yeah. Your specificity and sort of your specialization in amphibians, where did that come from specifically? Were you always sort of tracking towards that level of expertise with that specific group of animals, or how did that happen exactly?
I haven't always been an amphibian person. Yeah. I grew up in a part of Mexico, actually, that doesn't have, although Mexico has a great biodiversity in terms of amphibians, the area that I lived in didn't have a lot of species there. So I didn't really know what amphibians were until later in my life. So I actually got interested in amphibians through conservation. So one of the things I realized very quickly when I got into understanding the natural world was, all around us, you can see that there are major problems happening. And I wanted to contribute to that, not just contribute to a textbook. I wanted to contribute to trying to preserve what's out there, because I've been lucky enough to really recognize the beauty in the life that's out there. And so I've worked really hard to try to do that. And I ended up working on amphibians, not because they're amphibians per se, but because they're one of the most threatened group of vertebrates in the world. And it didn't really make sense. So these amphibians have been around for 360 million years. So they're one of the oldest of all vertebrates. They've done extremely well during that tenure on Earth. They've made it through the last 4 mass extinctions. I don't want to say unscathed, but they've done it quite well. And yet in the last 40 or 50 years, they're going through a huge contraction, a huge extinction event. And in many of those places where they're going extinct, they appear to be completely pristine, like Yosemite National Park, Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park, and other really well-protected areas around the world. So that's what really got me going, was the mystery of it, which is really what got me into science as well. But this is a place where science and conservation really cross paths and join paths in a sense.
For people that haven't taken a biology class in a while, just as a general definition of what an amphibian is, if you could just describe who they are, where they fit in.
You bet. So amphibians, there are 3 kinds of amphibians. There are the frogs and toads, there are the salamanders, and there are these things called caecilians. So these are the 3 orders of amphibians. They've been on Earth, as I said. They're one of the first land vertebrates. Okay, so they're a very, very ancient group of vertebrates. The fishes, of course, are the oldest group of vertebrates, and then amphibians are probably the next ones. They're different from other vertebrates in the sense that one of the particular things that they have different is that they have special glands in their skin that allow them to produce toxins. So there's a lot of things that people have heard of, these things like poison dart frogs, that sort of thing. They're really quite amazing also because they have a metamorphic life cycle, at least many of them do, where they have part of their life cycle as a as a larvae, like a tadpole, and then they metamorphose into these completely different organisms, these frogs or large salamanders that look and live completely different lives. So they're really amazing. And one of the things that's so cool about amphibians, they've been around for so long that there are so many different types of ways that they make a living that it's really quite remarkable.
Are they found all over the world or only really in certain specific areas?
Thanks for reminding me. Yeah, they're found almost all over the world. There are a few areas where there aren't any amphibians, like Antarctica. Although they used to be there when they were part of Gondwanaland, when Antarctica was part of Gondwanaland. So that's how old these lineages are.
And I want to talk to you more about amphibians specifically, but you mentioned the 5 major extinctions in the history of life on Earth. I know there's a lot of detail I'm sure you could go into. If you could maybe give a brief synopsis of those 5 mass extinction events and maybe the one that's the most significant in your mind, speak to it maybe a little bit more length.
Well, so we're talking over huge timescales, and In fact, there have been more than 5 mass extinction events. Those are just the sort of the biggest events. So, one of the things that evolutionary biologists like to point out is that extinction is a natural part of life on Earth. Mm-hmm. And something like 99% of all species that have ever existed have gone extinct. Mm. That sounds a little strange to say that today, because then we're like, well, if that's the case, then why do we care so much about what's here today? Well, the point is that although there's so much today, one thing you have to remember is that the length of time that we're talking about is almost unimaginable to humans. So, life has been around for a really, really long time. And of those 5 mass extinction events, the first one occurred during a time when life was really not very recognizable to what we see today. There were no vertebrates, or there was little representation in that in terms of vertebrates. It's the last 4 major events that have happened during the tenure of vertebrates. And, I would say, most people know about everybody knows about dinosaurs. That's the first thing that come up. And one of the things I always like to bring up is that when the dinosaurs went extinct, although some of their lineages survived, or one in particular, the birds, their imprint on Earth is gone. The imprint of amphibians hasn't really changed. There are species today that you can find that are ecologically identical to what they were like, 100 million years ago. There's a salamander that was found in the Caribbean recently that was in resin. And that salamander, looks incredibly similar to these salamanders that are alive today. And that was, it's 100,000 years old. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty amazing. The tenure of these animals on Earth has been really incredible. So getting back to the mass extinction events. So these are events that take place not over tens of years, not over hundreds of years, but over millions of years. Mm-hmm. And there's still a lot of debate about what exactly caused these extinction events. While there have been some extinction events, one in particular that was caused by the change, basically the change of the atmosphere of the Earth. That's when basically plants started changing the mixture of atmosphere on Earth. That was caused by species. That was one of the earlier ones. That one basically was a biological change caused. A massive extinction caused by biology. Yep. Sort of what's going on today, except that now it's just one species, and that species happens to be conscious of what it's doing. Mm-hmm. That's quite different. The other mass extinction events, the ones in between those bookmarks, are really caused by things like bolide impacts, so like asteroids hitting the Earth, or volcanic eruptions that are causing. That basically caused big changes, not only locally but also globally from volcanic kind of activity. So these were really massive things that changed the way that it changed the balance of life in terms of who the winners and losers were.
I know you mentioned, I think you're right, that most people know when they think of a mass extinction, they immediately think of the dinosaurs going extinct and what caused that. If I remember correctly, there's one of the 5 that caused, in terms of just general wiping out of the percentage of life on Earth, that was far greater than any other. Something like 90% of all life on Earth. If you could speak to what caused that and how that happened.
Well, that would be the earliest mass extinction event that I hinted to earlier, which was the one that actually changed the atmosphere of the Earth. So that one caused more damage than any of the other ones, in the sense that it just changed who could actually survive under those circumstances. So I believe that's the one that was the most impressive in that sense, and it was a game changer because it didn't just wipe out some area, like some geographic area gets wiped out by a volcano or something like that. It's or a bolide impact or a tsunami or something like that. I mean, these are things that are changing the way that life works, right? As opposed to just killing what's there and then some things recover. Right. And that's a big difference if you think about it. So the change of the atmosphere was, an enormous event in Earth's history. And in a sense, we're kind of doing that now. No, not in a sense. In reality, we are changing that right now.
And I want to talk about that. And it was a paper that you co-wrote that was titled in the form of a question of I believe it was, Are We Entering the Sixth Extinction, or Are We Experiencing the Sixth Extinction? And it was a view of that through amphibians. Are we?
Well, I think it's actually quite clear. If one of the ways that you're doing something right is when other people start using that same idea over and over again. And since we published that paper, that almost that exact title has been used multiple times. There's been a Pulitzer Prize winning book. There have been numerous papers and also sort of non-scientific sort of books and essays and that kind of thing using that same title. And I think the scientists are really conservative in a good way, in the sense that we don't like to wave our arms and say the sky is falling until we have data to back up what it is we're doing and what it is we're saying. And so with the Sixth Mass Extinction paper, it's kind of a big deal, like saying we're entering a mass extinction event right now. And that's kind of a big deal, because if you look at the history of mass extinction events, the previous ones all happened over much longer timescales. Even if you take the present mass extinction, the sixth mass extinction event, and use the biggest boundaries possible in terms of time, we're only talking about 10,000, maybe more years, not thousands of years, not millions of years. So if you talk about the extinction of the large mammals that Tony Barnofsky has written about, and others, that's sort of the long now view of what's going on in terms of extinction in the sixth mass extinction. And I think it's a pretty bold step to say we've entered the sixth mass extinction. But David Wake and I thought that we had a pretty good case to be made with this one ancient and quite successful group of vertebrates, the amphibians.
And what was the evidence that you primarily pointed to develop that argument? And also, I'm curious if this is applicable to other species outside of amphibians as well.
So the evidence that we used was what has occurred with amphibians in the last 40 years. Amphibians are a small enough group that we can get a handle on them, as opposed to, let's say, all of plant life. There's only about 7,400 species of amphibians these days. So it's a number that, if you put together all the people that work in amphibians and try to make an assessment of what's happened, we can try to decide what's going on with all known species, every one. And that's exactly what happened in a science paper that was published in 2004. And David Wake was one of the first people that sort of noticed that that people were talking about amphibian populations disappearing enigmatically in different parts of the world. And that was about 1988, 1989, when he started noticing that, he and others. And it took from that time in the late 80s until 2004 for a worldwide assessment to occur. It was the first worldwide assessment that was done for any of the world's vertebrates. Now we have one for birds, for mammals, I believe there's one in the works for fishes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really important for us to do that, because we're basically taking stock. What do we know? Right. And for every single species that was described in the world, scientists took a stab at it. And we said, what information do we have about their status? And we used very definable criteria and came up with a status. And one of the things we found, which was hugely surprising, is that over a third of the world's species were in decline and or threatened. Almost 42% of the world's species had suffered in one way or another. So maybe the whole species wasn't in decline, but part of their distribution was in major trouble. That's astonishing when you think about it. And if you had asked before this amphibian decline stuff started happening, if you had asked evolutionary biologists or conservation biologists, any kind of biologist you could think of, what's the most endangered group of vertebrates in the world? I guarantee you they wouldn't have said amphibians. They would have said probably mammals or birds, because those are the really visible ones that we know about. People know about the passenger pigeon, but they don't know about the relic frog, or they don't know about the cave salamander. They may not know these situations. But what we did leading up to that paper, and by we I mean the scientific community in general, we basically did an assessment and found that this was really it was a really bad case. And if you look back through evolutionary time, for what we know from the fossil record in amphibians, their presence can be found throughout the entire fossil record, despite the fact that there are these major extinction events. So the lineages of amphibians made it through through these previous extinction events very, very well. I mean, the tree was probably pruned, but major branches survived quite well.
And is the decline with all of the different animals that have been analyzed? You mentioned that there was a documentation in a paper about birds and others as well. Is it just the amphibians that are declining at a rate that would classify as trending towards extinction, or the others as well?
Well, the way we interpreted the information that we had was that the amphibians gave us the first world view of how bad things were, but unfortunately they're not the only ones. And if it was just the amphibians, then we could focus in on that and try to figure out what was going on. But it turns out that if you look at other vertebrates as well, mammals, especially if you looked at the last 10,000 years, but mammals for sure, there are many have either gone extinct or are on the brink of extinction. Birds as well, fishes, and not just vertebrates either. You start expanding out to other groups of species as well. And one of the things we see is that there is this overwhelming body of evidence that's building, that's showing that we really are at the beginning of an extinction event.
And with the amphibians specifically, is as you said, if this is true, then this is the first time that potentially a conscious animal who is causing this sort of problem is aware of its responsibility. What is the evidence for amphibians specifically that this is in part or in entirety human caused?
That's a great question. So with amphibians, we're talking about not just a dozen or so species that have gone extinct or are in trouble. We think we have at least 200 species that have gone extinct in the last few decades. 200 species. That's way more than we've documented in other groups in the last 100 years. We have another 500 species that are in decline. And we have at least 2,000 species negatively affected by different factors. Now, human activities are at the very top of that. If you look at the different factors that describe these reasons why amphibians have gone extinct, most of the reasons are habitat destruction. There's no doubt that if you go and chop down the rainforest and put in a parking lot or some other kind of development or a farm for cows, you're changing that habitat. And anything that lived there, if their entire species lived in that area, they're gone, and they're gone forever. And that's probably one of the most important impacts. But that, we can work with that into the future. We can figure out ways to not destroy habitat. We can try to restore some of the habitat. But it's what we called the enigmatic declines that really got us worried about a sixth mass extinction. And that was where we had species going extinct in areas that were highly protected, like Yosemite National Park and others throughout the world. And those are places where humans have decided, society has decided that we are going to try to preserve these places, these beautiful places, and preserve them from development, from pollution, from other sources of negative sources of intended and unintended consequences by humans. And yet we're losing species in those areas. So it was these enigmatic declines that got us really, really worried. So so humans are involved both directly in the decline of amphibians by destroying the habitat, by increasing levels of pollution, by spreading non-native species, both intentionally, like with trout into the mountains, and unintentionally, as with diseases. So we are for sure on the hook in terms of the effects that humans are having. Those are the direct influences, but there's also indirect influences like climate change, where we're figuring out that now just putting a fence around a habitat and preserving it is not enough because we are actually changing the entire ecosphere, the entire planet, just like those species changed the atmosphere in one of the previous extinctions.
When you talk about this and present this evidence to the public, and I'm sure you talk to a wide range of different people with different political views and different priorities and values, how do you try to reach as many people as possible? Do you posit this as we have a responsibility to preserve the beauty of nature? Do you preserve this as this is in our own self-interest to conserve these animals? How do you go about trying to make people have this resonate with people and make them do something about it or change their mind or those sorts of things?
I do all of the above because I really think that it's not one thing or another.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, we ethically, we have a really good reason to try to do something about these things. If humans are involved and we're leading to the decline of these species, just ethically, we should take responsibility for that. I also think that from the beauty side of things, there's something to be said for the world that we live in. We like to live in a beautiful world. I mean, there are so many benefits, both ones that you can quantify and ones that you can't. And humans, we have a lot of unquantifiable aspects of our lives, and we need to also pay attention to those. I also appeal to people, about future generations. I have children, and I want my children to see the beauty of this world that we live in. And I want to live in a way that's sustainable because, we have 7 billion people on Earth now. And many people, not too long ago in the 1960s, were saying that was going to destroy the Earth beyond all reason. And the truth is we're still here and we're still doing okay in a lot of ways. So I like to also motivate people by telling them that there is a positive side to all this, not just the self-preservation side, but there is a positive side to understanding the factors that are leading to these extinctions and to either postponing, hopefully permanently, or reversing the declines of these species. So let me just give you one real-world example. So I work on this disease in amphibians called chytridiomycosis. It's a fungal pathogen that causes the disease. It looks like all indications are that humans have moved this fungus around by accident. The fungus and it's been devastating amphibians, especially even in these protected areas. This one species of fungus, Batrachochytrium dendrobatitis, has driven probably 200 species to extinction, 200 species of frogs and salamanders to extinction. No single pathogen that we know of in the history of Earth has caused that much damage. So don't you think we should understand how that works? I do. Yeah. I'm glad it doesn't affect mammals. Luckily, it doesn't. But we need to understand the underlying biology behind this. What's really interesting about the story of chytrid, this fungus, is that many of these enigmatic declines we now think are basically explained by the arrival and invasion of this fungus. So many of these amphibian populations started disappearing in the early 1980s. It happened in California. It happened in Australia. It happened in Central America. It happened in South America. All over the world, this sort of event started occurring in these protected areas. Turns out that 20 years later, we figured out what it was. In 1999, we actually described what this fungus was. 1999. So the first decline actually in California was 1978 in the yellow-legged frog in Sierra Nevada. An unexplained mass die-off in Sequoia National Park. The next one was in Brazil. The next one was in Central America. Well, it looks like that those declines actually occurred because of this fungus. So fast forward now to the present, and I can tell you the next fungal pathogen that's occurred with amphibians is another type of chytrid fungus that's relatively closely related to chytrid, and it's another kind of chytrid, same genus, different species. That one was found in Europe. It was described in 2013. By 2014, scientists had already figured out where this pathogen came from, identified it, described it, figured out where it came from, and how it probably got there. So, we're learning a lot, and we're getting much better at figuring out what's going on. And I think that gives me a lot of hope, because these these pathogens, for example, these emerging diseases that amphibians are facing, it turns out it's not just amphibians. It's happening in bats and bees and plants and humans. And what people tend to forget is that the same underlying biology links together these different things.
When you think about the future, sort of looking forward a little bit, you mentioned your kids. Is it your opinion that there are things that we can do to avert a sixth mass extinction, or are there certain things in this process that are frankly just inevitable at this point?
Well, I think a lot of damage has been done. There's no doubt about that. So I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna, but there definitely has been a lot of damage done. But I also know that life is tenacious, and things will hang on. Sometimes in surprising ways. There have been already, just in the last few years, we've rediscovered numerous species of amphibians that we thought were extinct. So they've been hanging on in a few places. And I think we're getting to the point now where we have the opportunity to actually provide a pathway for them to survive. We understand now a lot more about how this pathogen works, for example, and we know what we can do about it. And in some cases, anyway, we can actually reverse that. So I'm actually pretty hopeful. Not to say that there's no damage done. There's a lot of damage that's been done, but I really do think that people are incredible in terms of the potential that people have, their creativity, their ability to really, decide they're going to do something and just not stop until they do it. And in some cases, those can be negative things, but in many cases, those are positive. And I really think that, if we can solve some of these issues in terms of conservation, in terms of understanding the mechanisms that are leading to these terrible patterns that we've been documenting, I think we can start working on these mechanisms and coming out with a positive outcome.
Last question I want to ask you is regarding that issue. If you were giving policy advice, or you were advising a nation or a political body in terms of what you could encourage them to do to begin that healing process, to create sound public policy, to raise consciousness, what are the few things that come to mind right away that make you that you would give as advice or recommendations for how to begin to turn the tide a little bit?
Well, I think for one, we need to think about how our actions get the repercussions of our actions. So, for example, we move species all over the place. And one of the problems that's happened in the last few decades is that we've gotten really good at moving things around the world very rapidly. So global trade is fantastic, and it's been really good for the world economy. It's been really good for raising people out of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. But it comes with a price, and we need to pay attention to that price and think about the things that we've done and what we could do to slow down those negative effects. So in particular, I'm thinking about the disease issue is a really easy one to tackle because it has huge negative implications. And yet there are ways that we can slow down, or at least, and maybe even stop the spread of some of these non-native pathogens. So, whenever we move live animals around the world, or plants, we need to think about, well, what's on these plants? In the 1950s, for example, we were in a time period when, like USAID was trying to help out other countries, other societies, by promoting economic activities that could help them raise money. So we were helping people plant soybeans in places that was a good place to grow soybeans. But we also helped people start things like frog farms. So people raise frogs on farms so that they could sell frog legs. People like to eat frog legs. Frogs are pretty easy to raise, even in really high densities. But they figured out that there's a few species that are really easy to raise. One of them happens to be the North American bullfrog. Well, now, unfortunately, there are North American bullfrogs being raised in farms all over the world, from Brazil to the Philippines. And when those North American bullfrogs escape from those breeding facilities, they not only cause problems directly because they insert themselves into those food webs, but they bring with them all the microbes that live on them, both good and bad. And it's those bad ones that we need to really, really worry about. So, there are things that we can do to regulate that.
Maybe one quick follow-up on that. How does climate change fit into all of this? Right, it seems like there are a variety of different elements to what's causing this decline in numbers within animals. Is climate change, in your mind, the number one issue, or is it more issues like the fungus that you were talking about? These communicable problems that can wreak havoc on entire species of animals. How do you sort of rank priorities in terms of what's the most important, what's second, third? How do you envision those?
Well, that's a really tough thing to handle, because these things are all intertwined, actually, and especially climate change. I mean, the thing about climate change that is so important is that people have to realize is that it's a global issue.
Right.
And we can deal potentially with some of these other issues like invading species. Mm-hmm. We can deal with them locally. Countries, municipalities, states, there are ways that we can deal with those things. Mm-hmm. But how, the climate, it's like that's bigger than any one group. And I think it actually leads to some pretty good potential possibilities where we can learn to work together. Mm-hmm. We have to learn to work together, mm-hmm. because if we want to live lives that include, productive, a productive world, then we want a world that's predictable.
Right.
And climate change, gives us a lot of unpredictability. Mm-hmm. And in many cases, very scary sort of options of what could happen. So, I wouldn't so much rank things, but I would say that climate change is something that we absolutely have to deal with. Mm-hmm. We can deal with that, but we have to deal with it at a kind of a high level in certain ways. But we can't just do one thing, basically. Mm-hmm. We have to do all of these different things at the same time.
Vance, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.